Hello, everyone. Today, Emerson and I will be discussing social structures in South America and the effects they're having on communities and individuals specifically. We will be looking at this problem through the lens of U.S. policies and interventions, and we will be discussing things such as the relationships between individuals, the representation, which would be the controlling images that are building up these structures and maintaining them, as well as the rules that are being applied to the people because of these structures. And to better give you an idea of who's being affected and how, we will follow up with a slide of El Salvadorians and the harms that they're facing through some quotes.
Go too deep into social structures in South America, we first have to recall the harm from our last video or slide deck. On our last slide deck, we included a video of some of the instances of fellow citizens and how they feel about their current living stature in South American countries, but we've narrowed them down to 4 different instances and 4 different quotes. The quotes being, "Fun, there's no fun here. You can go and look for some sticks and for firewood. That's the kind of fun that people who live here have." Or, "Due to the current insecurity, you have to lock yourselves inside the house. We have to go to bed around 4 or 5 p.m. Only God protects us here. Life is hard. You do not sleep at all. And and the cycle never ends. If you live in poverty, you don't get old because of the passing of time, but rather because of the hardships of the life you experience. People here only go to the hospital when there's an emergency, not for aches and pains. If someone gets hurt, sometimes they don't even have money to get a bus to the clinic." And we are recapping these harms because the societal structures people live in are things that are outside their domain. Many things like fun, insecurity, poverty, and hospitalization and healthcare are things that should be supplied by the government, not things that should be further limiting their capabilities and how they live their lives and fulfill their lives. Deep into describing how social structures affect South American countries, we first have to define what social structures are according to Eastwood, a philosopher who studies social structures and how interknitted they all can be. Relationships are the connection between individuals or groups, while rules are the formal or informal groups like laws, norms, or customs that govern behavior within a society or group. And finally, representation is how individuals or groups express themselves and have their voices heard or are included in the decision-making process within society, all according to Eastwood.
We will now be discussing some of the political interventions and structures that have led to the previously stated harms. Interventions by the U.S. made outside of the structures has brought about change in the following ways and have played a major role in shaping society. In Civic Foreign Policy by Svenja Blank and The Politics of Violence by Richard Millett, it is made clear that the U.S. involvement in El Salvador and Guatemala not only failed to stop violence, but it actually made the situation faced by the nations worse because it supported structures that fueled the violence to begin with. Millett explains that during the Cold War, while supporting anti-communist parties, the U.S. backed military governments in the name of fighting communism. These regimes were the leading factor in brutal massacres, limitations on people's rights, and deep inequalities within nations. In El Salvador, about 10% of landowners controlled nearly 80% of the good farmland, and U.S. support helped keep that elite power in group. This intervention destroyed the relationships between citizens and the governments who no longer served the people but instead protected elites' interests through both force and coercion. The rules that structure society, such as laws, institutions, and the norms people follow, were manipulated or just ignored to justify the repression that the government was acting on. Military power was given more importance than legal processes, and violence became a norm rather than an uncommon exception. U.S. involvement reinforced an environment where leaders weren't held accountable and the basic social contract was broken. Blank's research complements this by showing how religious and civic leaders, especially those advocating for the poor, were systematically targeted. With pastoral letters from Archbishop Romero and first-hand accounts from missionaries, she painted the picture of how representation was violently suppressed. Those brave enough to speak for justice and inclusion were eliminated, leaving entire communities without advocates in the political system. Not only are these advocates no longer speaking in their community, but this also puts fear into others who would want to speak up. In backing these regimes, the U.S. helped create a system where disagreement wasn't tolerated whatsoever.
He and Millet also showed that the U.S. role went far beyond indirect support. It was actually active and direct. U.S. trained parliamentary forces like Orden in El Salvador and Mano Blanco in Guatemala were key instruments of instating state terror. They were responsible for assassinations, disappearances, and even mass killings, all with the help of U.S. support, whether it's tactically or economically. The violent infrastructure supported by U.S. was shattered relationships between the citizens and their government. People could no longer trust the government that was meant to protect them. Instead, the country became a source of fear, especially for the poor, the activists, and religious leaders, such as Oscar Romero, depicted on the left. The rules that governed these societies were soon placed by repression and oppression. Legal systems that became tools of control and constitutional protection were disregarded in favor of military rule, secret police, and military tribunals. The U.S. continued to send military and economic aid despite these conditions, becoming complicit in dismantling the very foundations of lawful governments in these countries, especially in El Salvador. And its impact on the representation for individuals running in office was devastating. As Blanc documented through personal testimonies and religious archives, such as the assassination of Oscar Romero when he was giving a mass in central Salvador, in this capital, where he was shot and killed, actually hosting up the host, and was an active activist for equality among El Salvadorians. Those who spoke in the marginalized groups, such as priests, missionaries, and human rights activists, were silenced, whether captured or assassinated, just like Oscar Romero was. Political voice was stripped from entire sections of society. Even the well-intentioned U.S. aid programs, such as the Alliance for Progress, ultimately funneled resources to elite-controlled institutions, reinforcing exclusion rather than alleviating it. What Millet and Blanc both make clear is that U.S. intervention does not distort foreign policy outcomes. It actually dismantles the elements of a functional society within these countries. By undermining the relationships of trust and rewriting rules to justify violence and erasing the representative voice inside these countries, the U.S. turned these fragile democracies into battlegrounds of authoritarianism and inequality. Any questions?